All right, welcome back. Today is hopefully going to be a fun day of reading and dissecting and learning from how people write good papers. We have three for today. I'm ambitious. I think we can do three. So last time we spent I think the whole class on two, but I think we could do a little better. So I'd like to do the Twitter paper first, just because chronologically it maybe makes most sense. And yeah, we'll take it from there. So that would be Andre, I think. Um,
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I am doing the paper Software Engineering at the Speed of Light, How Developers Stay Current Using Twitter. This was presented in May 2014, so some of the technologies may be a little dated. Oops, can I go back? Okay. So this week we're looking at the problem, gap, and hook concepts. So the problem, gap, and hook in this paper are all found within the first three paragraphs. So I just highlighted these. If you didn't read the paper, where you can find it. So the problem in this paper is that developers struggle to keep up with the fast-paced information landscape that is software and software development. The gap that they identify is that we don't know why some developers are adopting Twitter and others don't. And the concept here is not just the use of Twitter, but it's the actual appropriation of Twitter for their communication, collaboration, information dissemination, that kind of stuff. So why are some developing it, or sorry, why are some developers using it and some aren't? We currently, at this time, and what they talk about, already kind of have an understanding of how people or developers are using email. They're using it for commits and commit messages and code review coordination. Then they also have the IRC, which is Internet Relay Chat, I think, and that's an instant messenger type situation. They're doing that for code development. And then there's GitHub is around by this point. So they're using that as a community. And all of these things are contributing to that concept of collaboration, communication. Yes.
how did you juggle all Zoom thing?
With lines and boxes. Yeah, it just took a second, but and then the hook itself is so why this is important, why this research matters is because understanding the Twitter adoption by developers can help us better inform better developer tool design. Twitter is a good case for this because at the time, it's probably even wider now, maybe. I'm not sure. I haven't looked since it became X, but in the paper, it states at this time they had more than 500 million registered users and more than 500 million tweets per day. So it's a really large platform, a lot of information to look at. So I could be wrong, but I believe that all the research questions are exploratory. And these are, do you want me to go through the research questions? Okay, so they have 5 research questions, just generally looking at how Twitter is increasing software development awareness on people, trends, practices, how it's nurturing relationships between developers, and then of course looking at why people or developers are using Twitter, and then reasons for non-adoption. So this study, the researchers conducted a grounded theory-based study, which means that they're collecting data before hypothesizing anything. And yeah, so data before theory, basically. So for their timeline, how they structured everything. So I can't see my notes because I'm sharing my screen. So, but how they structured everything is they started with an exploratory survey, moved on to semi-structured interviews based on the results of the survey. Then they did a data review on those 2 pieces, answered their research questions, and then validated the results with a validation survey. And I'll talk about each one a little bit more in depth. So the initial survey responses were taken and used as a guide for the semi-structured interviews. So this was phase 1. They sent out a little over 1,100, I guess, they sent out the survey to over 1,100 GitHub users, and they received 271 responses. These were mostly professional developers, and a lot of people use Twitter at least once per week. And then there's some data on the general account information. So the thing that I thought was really interesting was 41,079 tweets on one account. But if you look at it, it's only like 8 per day if it's the longest living account. So it's actually not that much, but it feels like a lot. So the point of the survey is they're looking for developers who do and do not use Twitter, so that they can kind of get that understanding on both sides. The follow-up interviews were conducted as like a subset of the survey responses. So they had 97 participants who actually agreed to do the follow-up interviews, but they only needed 27. They felt that they had like achieved their like the capacity for the themes or whatever they were looking for, with just 27 interviews. See a saturation, yeah. I told you I can't see my notes. That's okay. That's okay. I'm not that worried about it. Okay, so from this group, again, it's a smaller subset. 93% were professional developers, and now an even higher amount, 81% use Twitter at least once per week. Again, a little bit of data on their Twitter accounts and the number of tweets on each of the accounts. The type of interviews, they were semi-structured. They were conducted over Skype, and they were recorded and then transcribed. And the average time for the interviews was 38 minutes. I think the median was like 36 or something. Anyway, so then at that point, they took the data from the initial survey, the exploratory survey, and the interviews, and they went through and answered their questions. When they were analyzing the data, they did things, they analyzed it with like memos, they did like a lot of comparisons between different people's feedback, and then axial coding to kind of generalize the answers into kind of different categories. And they did that to answer their research questions and then sent out a validation survey to confirm their theories. They got over 1,200 responses. I think these were sent through GitHub again, but I didn't put that on there. And again, a lot of professional software developers, a lot of people who use Twitter at least once per week. And excuse me, of the more than 1,200 responses, more than half said that they indicated that they use Twitter for their development related work. So these people were particularly interesting because that's what they're specifically looking for in their research questions. And then the results generally were kind of what you'd expect if you're familiar with social media. So the benefits of Twitter were the concept of like serendipitous learning, where you're learning things that you hadn't necessarily been looking for, kind of just like stumbled upon it. You get the option to follow people or projects that you're interested in. And if you have questions about stuff, you can kind of put it out there and kind of get like a whole lot of opinions and ideas on how to approach the question. The challenges they found were the content volume versus how much you can actually consume, like how much content you can actually consume that's reasonable. Maintaining a relevant network. And then the reasons for non-adoption were that were reported were like too much noise, the character constraint, and the lack of conversation support, which they just mean that if you have like an ongoing conversation, there's not a lot of support for like maintaining that conversation like long term, like going back and referencing it if there's like information you need from it. And then also reporting that there was no understanding of the actual benefit to Twitter. And then that's everything. That's my summary of the paper. Good.
Dissect the design of it.
Yeah.
The paper, not the slides.
Do you want me to pull the paper up?
No, so like you said, initial survey, followed by interviews.
Yep.
Followed by more survey.
By a validation survey, yep.
So like a lot of work.
It does feel like a lot of work.
Why do you just want work?
I think if I had to guess, it's because they are, again, like the questions were exploratory. They didn't have like a good understanding of like anything for like a causality behind it. They didn't have, yeah, I feel like it was just really exploratory because it was just kind of not well understood. I don't know when Twitter started, but yeah, I'm assuming in 2014, maybe it was just not super well explored.
What does the initial?
Sorry.
This is, we haven't seen this before.
Mhm.
We've seen interviews followed by a larger scale survey before, maybe.
I think it gives better, so if you do like a large scale survey and kind of get an understanding of like what people are saying about their use for Twitter and things like that, then you can kind of narrow that down and get better questions for the interview because you want like richer questions and richer answers. And if you just go into an interview blind without having that first initial like exploratory survey, then you might be missing trends that you didn't think to ask about, or yeah, that's my understanding.
How big was that, the initial one?
The initial one, they sent out like over 1,100, but I think they got like 270 responses.
Not small.
Oops. Yeah, 271 responses.
This was only so they could be confident in what questions they were asking in the interviews. Basically.
I'm guessing, I don't remember reading that, if they had like any specific reason for outside of that, but that's my understanding in terms of like that kind of methodology of doing an exploratory survey, going to before doing like an interview.
And then they had some hypotheses as a result of the interviews, or why did they do a follow-up survey after that still?
Yeah, I think because, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like from what I read, it was more of like theories that they developed to answer their research questions. And when you're asking like a small subset of people these questions, you can come up with some pretty good theories. But if you want to, on such a big platform with so many users, especially like developers and stuff, like you can get a broader sense of like what's actually like what theories are actually real. Like, is this a valid theory, or is this just like a one-off with this subset of people that happen to answer our survey?
The interview.
Well, I meant the initial survey, but yeah.
Right. Which the interviews were just diving deeper into. Yeah, so it's the same pattern we've seen before. There was just something exploratory, in this case, two methods here. They combined the initial survey with interviews, something exploratory to build theory, and then you do something to confirm said theory and follow up steps.
On like a broader scale. Yeah.
Or in a different context.
Yeah.
Like to study variation in your theory. I guess we've seen this before with the marketing viral impulse buying. The same pattern, but they could have stopped, you know, with the half of this paper, like they've done the initial survey and the interviews. That could have been it, right? But they did not. They did this other big hard thing afterwards that gave them a lot more, you know, richness, a lot more confidence in the things they were observing, maybe some interesting. Was there any disagreement? Is it just confirmation of stuff from phase one? Is there any interesting disagreements in the last step? Well,
and I could be misunderstanding this, but again, I think their questions were more exploratory. They weren't like specifically looking for causality or anything like that. So there wasn't really anything that they had hypothesized that would have been some like to disagree with, I guess. It was more, instead of being like them saying like, we think this is causing this, and then validating that, they're saying what could possibly be causing this. So I didn't really see anything that was like, yeah, like specifically disagreements or anything like that, but is that what you mean?
Just think about it, you know, they could have discovered a set of reasons why something is happening, why people use or not Twitter in phase one. And when doing phase two, they could have discovered additional ones, or they could have discovered that some of the ones they thought were prominent in their first sample didn't show up much or at all, and you know, in the second one. So like you could still compare and contrast.
That's a good point, yeah.
I think the, you know, the theme of the learning approach.
Yeah. They do have like their database, like they have like the location of like where their survey and like database of all the responses and stuff I think exists, but I didn't particularly come through that and look for that. So I just kind of stuck with the prompts.
So I guess what I'm saying also is, you know, don't just add a survey to an interview study because it makes the paper longer, right? So you should add a survey to an interview study if it helps you compare and contrast and discover something useful from that addition. Not you know, I feel like if you just, so the impulse buying paper had discovered some things from the phase two that they had not anticipated in phase one, if I remember correctly. So that's really nice, right? It shows the value of doing this work. I think it's still valuable if you find all the same things, if you can confirm it on a larger scale, but still useful. I personally find it more satisfying if you find some interesting wrinkle or contrast or something. If there's some tension, it feels like more, exciting to read. There's more work being to investment of doing this follow-up thing.
Yeah, next time I do this, I'll look through the questions, maybe look for some variances there.
The other thing I want to ask is how do they sample participants? What strategies do they use?
So they sent out, I don't think they specifically disclose how they did that, but I'm assuming they sent it out to GitHub accounts. And I think they were targeting people who also had Twitter accounts. So I'm not sure if they like had some system to like verify those. And then in the initial survey, they got consent to be contacted again, or like volunteers, what they call it, for the interview. Second part.
Was it random or were there some inclusion criteria or did it follow some strategy for recruiting participants?
Yeah, I don't remember specifically.
I noticed you saying something before, which I thought was interesting. Lots of variation in levels of experience and frequency of use of the
yeah.
all of that. Which reminded me of the thing we mentioned last time, the maximum variation strategy for sampling participants. So it seemed to me like they did this deliberately to try to look for these differences. They, I guess, expected that the people with more experience or less of the platform or of their profession, right, would use the platform differently, and they wanted to give themselves the chance to detect that if that was the case. Because otherwise, if you just sample, not as deliberately, you may end up with a much more uniform sample.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Any more thoughts on this? Has anybody else looked at this?
I have a question. Does the exploratory survey help come up with the research questions, or are they written up before that?
My understanding, I actually looked for this specifically because there was some wording in two different parts of I don't have the paper up, but in two different parts of the paper that made me think that they had developed the research questions after, but I actually think that they developed the research questions prior, and then they just used the data from the exploratory survey and then the interview to actually try to answer those questions. So like come up with like theories as to like theories for the answers to the research questions, and then did the validation survey to actually validate that. That's like how I read that.
I mean, the questions can also evolve through the process.
Yeah, 100%.
So another way to think about this, we talked about how interviews are more useful than surveys, even though you necessarily do them on a smaller scale, because you get an opportunity to ask follow-up questions and understand something better. So, this pattern where there's a survey followed by interviews is also very common when there's something unclear from the surveys. Right? Surveys, you get some short answers, but they seem to point in some really interesting direction. So then you give yourself the opportunity to contact the survey respondents again. Like if you track who they are, for example, you can do that. Or maybe you ask them to, give you their contact information or something. They're willing to be contacted for follow-up questions. And when you see these interesting things that you don't fully understand from the survey responses, you go back and you do some additional interviews, right, to clarify all of these things that seem. Like you often see that pattern, which is maybe also what they did here.
Yeah, one of the projects I'm working on right now, we're doing like that exactly, because we actually started trying to do the interview first, and then we realized that there were a bunch of assumptions and stuff that we were making that we were like, we actually need to check and see if these developers are actually even using these tools or how they're using them before we even know what questions to ask. So
anything else? Do they include their protocol as a paper? Is that in?
I believe they put a link to it. I have to double check. I don't remember, but I think they have like I think it maybe is like a GitHub link or something. I don't remember, but it's where they have everything that you can access. So
Best practice, their own. Okay, thank you very much. Should we do sex workers or should we do prompting? Go for it. Let's do prompting.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about this paper called Prompts Are Programs Too. The context is that nowadays there's millions of people using this software that's kind of powered by AI. So there's like some, code wrapper, and somewhere in there, there's like an LLM that's getting like a prompt, and it's generally like the same prompt every time with like some inputs from the users. And so examples of these are like, Copilot, Google AI search, and then nowadays there's like these agentic AI things, and they're doing a whole lot. This paper only came out like less than a year ago, I think, and I feel like it was already like a little bit dated in some ways. Um, but anyway, yeah, um, they identified that the current literature studies like prompt engineering in some ways, and this is more about how people like kind of use prompts or change their prompts to make the model do what they want. And it's kind of, they're making a distinction between this prompt engineering and prompt programming, where um, it's like a software where it's like the same prompt and different inputs. Um, and so this, I guess, has not been studied before. And even prompt engineering had limited literature. So their question was, how do programmers develop programs that incorporate natural language prompts? And so that was their only research question. It's very broad and exploratory. And they used this Strauss grounded theory method for like developing a theory from this qualitative data. And so this is kind of like an iterative thing. They started by like reading some literature, and they selected this pretty methodically. And I guess they said they also had some domain expertise. Um, and then they did their collection and like um, um, analysis like in a loop to determine like the next interviews, the way that they would be run. And they also kind of incorporated this into the sampling so they could get like as much difference as possible. Um, and then finally they did their like validation, where they contacted 8 of their interviewees and 1 expert to like check if their theories made sense. They triangulated it with some literature, and they did some statistical tests to make sure that all of the interviewers were coding things like pretty much the same way. Yeah, so their setup was they had 45-minute Zoom interviews with $20 compensation, and they tried to focus on making the interviewees show the prompts. So it was like basically to force them to recall or make sure that they were remembering properly. And we talked about this last class, I think, where trying to like make them walk through is better than just asking them to remember. Um, So they had like their interview process. They started with the background survey, and then they asked them to define what a prompt program is, and then they tried to like agree on the same definition that they had come up with. And then they had them try to recall the last program, and they intentionally tried to discuss challenges before the process because they thought that it could like bias people if they discussed their process before the challenges. Yeah. So they interviewed 20 people. They had experience ranging from 3 to 20 years with a median of 8.5. And they had like a pretty wide range of prompt programs written. I mean, notably missing is 0 prompts, which I guess you can't study. But maybe asking why people have never tried it would be interesting. And median 10. So I think there were some like prompt programming experts maybe, but I think that 10 is not a huge number. They had a really wide range of domains and contexts. And then they tried to get like a good variety of prompt types and models used. Yeah, and they used, so they did maximum variation sampling, and they also did snowball sampling. So they asked like their people to recruit more, I think. It's like a pyramid scheme. They asked the people who they interviewed to ask for, yeah. Um, so yeah, they tried to do like a retrospective thing. It was semi-structured, so they had that outline where they discussed the definition and the other things I said. And yeah, and they were intentional about this part, discussing the challenges before the process. And then they tried to focus on these themes, which kind of emerged in their like iterative process. Um, and these are also, I think, based in like software engineering literature as well. Um, yeah, and so there's some sample questions. They had a list of all the questions in the process attached somewhere. Um, and yeah. So they identified a few threats to validity. Um, Mainly there were the memory bias on the participants and then confirmation bias from the authors, which would affect their like coding and theory development. They said that this was mitigated by lit triangulation, but I feel like that's a little bit suspect because it feels like it just changes what their preconceived biases are. Um,
What does that mean exactly?
so they were worried that their pre-existing thoughts of what prompt programming is could affect how they code things. And so if they read the literature and their opinion is now more closely matches the literature, it makes it seem like they will now still be biased, but they're biased towards the existing literature, which might help if they were like initially way off the rails or something, but it might also just make them more like uniform with everyone else. Um, so one thing that they mentioned is they said they recruited from the author social networks, which conflicted with something they said before about using like GitHub and like all this. I assume they just used both, but many of the interviewees, I guess, were close to the authors or something. There is self-selection bias anytime there's like an interview. Only people who agree will interview. Um, and then I think 3 of the interviewees could not show prompts or did not want to show prompts or talk too much about their exact use case. Um, and yeah, I think the conclusion validity, they tried to make sure the authors were all like on the same page with everything and coding consistently. And so they did their validation pass with 8 participants and an expert. I think that potentially having like a larger survey for validation at the end might make more sense because 20 is like a small sample size. And if they got the theory from these people, then it's likely to agree with those people. But maybe it would have been nice if they checked it against like a larger sample or something. Um, yeah, so summary, they have a very broad exploratory question. They had this like iterative process with a lot of validation at the end. Um, and they also continued after the theoretical saturation at like n equals 12 up to 20 people. So their findings were, so they did also have like a diagram of like the process for how they theorized that people write these prompt programs. And then there was also these like main 4 barriers that they grouped their codes into. And this was understanding formal, wait, no, not formal, foundation model behavior, um, accommodating for like the randomness and stochasticity, and then accurately using their language and testing the prompts programs. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to match these findings with the question because these themselves are not like an answer to the question. But I think the hypothesized like flowchart they made was not necessarily like a match for everyone, surely.
Same one.
Um, you can't write like a one process fits all. That's very descriptive, I guess.
You're saying the findings here don't directly map to the broader question, the research question they have in the beginning?
Yeah, I didn't include the flowchart thing that they had, which was, I guess, really more of an answer to this. Um, I think I I felt that they focused on these more as well, but I might be off.
I think there's necessarily some degree of subjectivity here of the researchers.
Yeah,
They, there'll be different ways in which you can interpret some of the same data. And the research team will have a lot of input into what they find most interesting and, what they choose to highlight in the paper. There could be lots of reasons for this. Maybe the most common reason is what they expect is the biggest gap in the literature, or another reason to be what they are working on for the next paper. They want to set the up for that, or lots of reasons why people can go in one direction.
I think these 4 barriers were found in like a very principled way where they had like the codes and they like unanimously voted on like the categories versus that like flowchart is more like a very interpreted thing.
Got it, I see.
So it feels like anyone would have almost found the same barrier. Like it feels like this part is reproducible. And the other is, just a lot more subjective.
Got it. In general, feels reproducible is a good vibe to go for in all research, including qualitative research. I'll share some pointers for kind of best practices for reporting on types of research. So I mentioned earlier, sharing the interview protocol is one of these best practices, but being transparent about exactly what is being asked, etc. It's like, actually, there's a few things here, like fit check. Tell us a bit more about this if you sort of picked up on what that was.
I think I don't remember exactly how they asked their like participants, but they basically told them their findings and saw if it made sense.
So another term you will see this under, or related term is member checking. Seen this before? So it's this idea that you have collected some data from your interviewer survey participants and done some qualitative analysis of said data, and you have arrived at some interpretation of that data. But you will have, for example, identified these barriers. That is your interpretation, your view, the researcher's interpretation of what you heard through the interviews or whatever. Like it's your interpretation. So it's really good practice to go back to the people that produced that data in the first place and vibe check this. Say, hey, here, now that we've talked to everybody, here's sort of what we're seeing emerging across all of these interviews. Does this make sense to you? And if not, why not? Right, and and then they could say, oh yeah, this is a nice way to think about it, or like, or you're completely wrong, right? So they could say, no, this is not at all what I meant, right? You're really, misinterpreting something I said, right?
They do it in follow-up interviews or just in surveys, what do they do?
Yeah, great question. So do you know?
I don't remember, but I think it was like an interview, but not like that methodical maybe. Or I don't remember.
The cheapest way I've seen people do this is just in some communication between email or something like this. If you follow up with people over email, you've had this conversation from scheduling the interviews in the first place and whatnot, and you follow up with them, and you could send them the relevant sections or whatever, the findings. You can even send them the whole draft if you would like, and ask them to look at it, and they may not have that much patience or time or interest. But you can certainly send them the bits that are relevant to the conversation you've had or whatever. And ask them to reply to you, right, to comment on that. Report in the paper on how many of these responses you got back and what you've learned from them, and how you've adjusted your findings or whatever based on the additional feedback you received through this bit check, member check process. Something like that is common.
I think it's interesting that they also asked an expert.
Yeah, why did they do that?
I don't know. They also
Why is that a good thing?
What did they ask the expert? To validate their findings?
yeah, the same as they asked the members.
I think it reduces the author bias. Like the authors are biased to have some good complete findings so they can publish a paper. But other experts, authors assume are also experts in the field, as they claim earlier, domain expertise.
I think for me, it was stranger in the context of peer review. Yeah, it's a little bit weird, because I think that often the peer review is like the ethos of the paper, I guess, and they're adding like another thing before that. They also said that all of the interviewers were experts in the domain. So I think it probably doesn't hurt, but I was kind of like, it just seemed weird to me.
So the core question for all research or papers is always, why should you trust what we're saying? You, the authors, should ask yourselves this question: why should my readers trust what I'm saying, what I'm claiming in the paper? So that's the driving force. So that's also the driving force for this bit. The member checking was this. Right? Why should you trust that these barriers that we've identified are the right barriers? Well, because, for example, in addition to us, the research team, the participants themselves, when reflecting back on how we articulate them, they agree that this is an appropriate synthesis of their thoughts. Similarly, because a third party domain expert, that's not us, the research team, with whatever biases we may have, also independently agrees that this is an appropriate. It's like adding a peer reviewer to your submission already, right? And to getting them really immersed in the process and the findings. Right? I think fundamentally it increases the level of trust in the claims the paper is making, right, from a reader's perspective. I think all of these kinds of things that researchers do, right, are for this purpose, to increase the level of trust that readers have in the claims they're making. And we've seen good examples of all of these practices, including here in the paper before as well, triangulation, member checking, all of these clear reporting and transparency, etc. Lots of things like this. All of these practices are so that you can trust the claims they're making more than if they hadn't followed, these practices. That's really the key. So I think it adds trust. That's it.
I think this notion of they're asking both the members and the expert, I guess, about the interpretation rather than the results, as in like they're not saying here is what we found, do you agree? They're saying here's how we interpreted this. I guess that is like a much different thing.
Yeah, exactly, because the interpretation is, subjective, right?
Yeah.
From the perspective, for the position of the research team. By the way, so the next paper is really great at some of these. I think you'll see a lot of, they have a really good positionality statement. I don't remember if Professor Chu had that. And, things like this, like, necessarily we all come from, our backgrounds and our training and our biases, sort of philosophical biases at the beginning of the semester. So it's always good to sanity check, vibe check the stuff you're claiming, your interpretation, what you see in the data, right? Contrast that against somebody that's from the community, which is the next paper, somebody from the domain here, same thing. So I think that's really why you're doing this. Like, this is why these are good papers. That's why we're reading them. We're reading them so that we can hopefully recognize these elements so that you can copy them next time you do a paper of your own.
How about the fact that they don't reach the saturation thing? Just 20 interviews, and I don't think.
You said they reach at 12.
Yeah, they reached it at 12.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Missed that time. So why did they do 8 more?
Some of this is also paper engineering. This is why, for example, this is why maybe it's still useful to have an advisor, PhD advisor, and not just like do all of this with an agent. Because your PhD advisor will have a good sense of the unwritten tacit knowledge from their field and kind of the peer review quirks and whatnot. Like you will see, I think we'll be very honest in this class about this. You will see all kinds of paper engineering things too. By the way, this mixed methods design, this idea of combining methods, especially in software engineering, which is a field that's historically very technical and did not have a lot of empirical research. Sophistication of empirical research methods in software engineering is not very high historically. So people started doing empirical research and then they started doing mixed methods empirical research. For example, combining interviews with surveys or interviews with quantitative analysis or statistics of repository data or whatever. And a lot of these are kind of following the recipe very poorly. There was a perception, there may still be a perception that you have to do mixed methods in your paper, otherwise the paper is not strong enough, so we're going to reject it. You have used one method, but you haven't used the other one. Reject just because you're not taking the method box, right? So I think you will see reaction from the community also in this sense of paper engineering. Like let's add a survey component to something that doesn't really add any value. We don't really need it, but just as reviewers might complain about it. So I really don't like any of this stuff. I think we're trying to pick here papers that are not that at all, but stuff that really is there for a reason and adds value. But I think often there's always pragmatic constraints as well. If you just submit 12 interviews, people might complain that it's new and they might not trust that you've reached saturation. So if you had 8 more that you could schedule easily, why not do those 2, right? But certainly won't harm your paper, right? It might help your paper. Maybe you won't learn anything new in this case because they've reached saturation, but your paper will look better. So
I mean, you have to do more interviews to know that you've reached saturation, right?
how did they decide that they've reached saturation?
It was when their code stopped changing, I think.
Is there some sort of vibe based or?
The I mean, my understanding is they all developed like new codes while interviewing and then they merged them. And then I think 12 is when like the code book, after that, there were no changes made to it.
One pattern I like that I've seen sometimes is, so what you described, that you keep refining the code book. We should talk a bit about the coding here too. You keep refining the code book until it doesn't change anymore. But the until it doesn't change anymore, you formalize. You say, until the next N interviews, do not change your right? It may be unreasonable to expect that one more interview is going to be enough. But you could say, I'm gonna always look 5 ahead or something. And when I've done 5, but I have not touched the code book anymore, then I stop, right? So you can define the stopping criterion formally, and report on it in the paper. I've seen papers do this, by saying, I stop after 5 consecutive interviews. Do not reveal any new themes or something like that.
Do people do stuff like once they're done with a couple of interviews, they kind of check for all sorts of combinations of them and see when the new coding things change?
I don't know what you mean.
So like for example, let's say after 5th interview, they realize that 5th to 10th, there was no change in the code book. So technically they have the saturation at 5.
Right.
Do they end up doing some other random combination of 7th interview, then 1st interview, then 2nd interview?
Good idea. I've not seen that. I've just sort of seen it linearly in that sense. I mean, you can do whatever. I think the important point is that you stop when you reach theoretical saturation, and you can be as strict about how you define and operationalize that as you want. Often it's based on vibes, but I think a better paper will have an explicit saturation criterion that they follow and report on in a paper. There were a couple more things I wanted to touch on here. Maybe could you go back one? Yeah, so what are these things? I don't remember us talking about these. There's 3 mentions here of 3 types of validity: internal, external, and conclusion. Have we talked about this before? We have?
We have not.
Okay. Does anybody have any knowledge of this? Have you seen these terms before? Please.
So I think internal validity is anything with respect to the participants of with respect to the team who's conducting the analysis. So maybe like any sort of bias that the researchers might have and stuff. External validity is more about the data correction. So what things could have gone wrong, or maybe things that are not reflected in the data. And conclusion, I'm not sure.
That's not quite right. Let's see another one. How have you seen these terms used?
Internal validity could refer to like the validity of the process of your research. External is the generalizability of the results.
Yeah.
And conclusion validity is just like the conclusions you have drawn with your data.
Right. So the internal versus external is super important, and you see this all the time. Internal is about the soundness of the process. Is this a sound process? Is your experimental design sound? Is your whatever sound? External is about generalizability. Does what you found here apply anywhere else? And why do you believe that it does or it doesn't? So we've talked a lot about this before. What's a great way to increase external validity?
Mechanisms,
Theory, right? So that's it, right? The external validity is an argument for the conditions under which your theory may or may not hold elsewhere. So, for example, we study open source software a lot in my group, and often we have to reason about whether commercial software development is different in some fundamental way from open source software development, such that the phenomena or conclusions we're observing in the open source world do not carry over or do carry over, and commercial development. And, this is a question that reviewers often have, and it falls under external validity. It's something that we have to think about and reason about. So that's one example. Right, so like here, if they recruit from their social networks, right, these are people, I don't know, close to CMU researchers, right, in computer science. Would people sampled from different populations, right? Would they look different in how they use prompt programming, right? Would they face the same barriers? Like these kinds of questions, like how far can you stretch your claims? It's all about that.
But isn't that a process thing? Recruiting from author social networks? So shouldn't that go to the internal validity part? External validity is more about generalizability of results, right?
So it does not compromise the process, right? So sampling from your social network does not compromise the soundness of your data collection or analysis necessarily.
I mean, that is data sharing.
Data collection is doing the interview.
Yes. Makes sense.
Where you sample from may not compromise how well you run the interviews. If you ask questions well, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But it could compromise whether your findings apply elsewhere. So I think that's why it's there. And you'll also see construct validity also often. I don't know that they mentioned it here. In measurement studies, quantitative studies where you measure things and do statistics, that's very often a concern. So, again, like we're operating at the level of these theoretical constructs and theory and mechanisms, but we're able to measure concrete variables, right? We're not able to measure this theoretical construct directly. It's not usually observable, right? We need some proxy measure or measures of some underlying theoretical construct. That's always a translation, operationalization problem. So the question is always, to what extent are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring? Right? For example, you want to make claims about, code quality or developer productivity or whatever. You want to make claims about these constructs, but you're measuring, lines of code. Right, so like this is a construct validity concern. So you should think about this and have a discussion in your paper about why you believe the variables you're capturing are appropriate measures of these underlying constructs that you really care about. Right? Nobody cares about lines of code per se, right? If you're using that measure for whatever reason, it's measurable. Right? You care to make claims about some underlying construct, right? Again, mechanisms, theory, all of that. You just happen to be able to measure these things operationally. Right? It may or may not, be an appropriate approximation of the actual construct. So there's also a lot of that. Yeah, I guess conclusions more. Yeah, it's about the analysis. How do you reach conclusions? Maybe one back still. You had a list of example questions. Yeah.
Who was it?
Oh, please, sure, of course.
About the retrospective style of interview. Why do you think they apply that here? Why use it in this context?
I think it was pretty much entirely to make sure that their memories were good and that they were like speaking about like real things that they've done instead of like if you ask maybe like how do you prompt program in general, they might talk about like how they plan to or something that they haven't actually done yet.
And to get the interviewees to answer the things they are trying to look for in other stuff.
Yeah, I think it's trying to like keep them honest in a sense, and not add maybe their own like speculation or something like that.
On this, I like the questions they had, and you had some sample questions. Maybe next slide. Yeah,
Here.
here. So like, look how they phrase these. Think of the most recent time you wrote such a prompt. Right? So you can put yourself in that situation, like go back to that place. You know, do you have one in mind, right? So like, I'm confirming that you can even do this before, you know, you make one up, just to answer what I'm asking next. Are you there, right? Are you in that place? Do you still have the prompt, right? Or are you sort of making stuff up from memory? Do you have it in front of you, right? Can you actually look concretely at it? Can we talk specifically about this concrete prompt that you wrote?
Yeah, and I think they actually like did look at it in most of the cases. Um,
13.
yeah,
So, you know, we talked a lot last time about asking about concrete, specific situations, examples, whatever, not about generalities. Like, you know, this looks like a good example of that, right? You know, let's talk about the specific prompts that you wrote recently that you hopefully remember better, the context around it. Let's talk about this and walk through it specifically, concretely, with, you know, put it in front of us. Not just, you know, like what kinds of challenges have you experienced when you've been prompting in the past? It's a really different, hugely different level of quality of the information that you can get from your participants this way. So hopefully you see these examples implemented in these papers that we're reading, doing this thing that I mentioned last time. Right, that's all I have for this one. I want to leave some time for the other one, which is also a really awesome paper. Any more comments on the fund programming paper? All right, thanks a lot.
So this paper was titled Disadvantaged in the American-Dominated Internet, Sex, Work, and Technology, and it was presented at the 2021 CHI conference. Okay, so the problem discussed was the authors talked about how technology is an ever-changing field and it impacts how a lot of professions operate. And there's been a lot of prior work studying how businesses, the stock market, how everything changes as technology evolves. However, the profession of sex work has had very little study, and most of the studies about technology and sex work have focused on the client side. So like support networks for sex workers and those with porn addictions, porn websites, things like that. But the authors could find no prior work on how sex workers use technologies as part of their profession. So the authors use this paper to explore the specific ways sex workers use technology in their profession and the specific barriers present in current technology because of the profession. So they really only asked one main research question, which was supposed to be descriptive and exploratory of how do sex workers use technology. For the study itself, before they performed the study, they did an informal web analysis to inform their interview protocol. They explicitly mentioned that this is not meant to be mixed methods, but it was supposed to be an informal analysis, so that way they could develop an accurate protocol and have the correct language when talking to sex workers. They performed 29 semi-structured interviews, and they interviewed sex workers in both Germany and Switzerland. They specifically chose these two countries because that is where sex workers are legal, where sex work is legal, and where some of the researchers had in-person access to sex workers. They specifically recruited through brothels, word of mouth, and snowballing, and physical flyers. The interviews themselves were performed 3 ways, either through video, audio, or text-based chats. A lot of the workers were of some minority and felt that their privacy was very important. So a lot of them were conducted in an anonymous fashion. So they did not report on things like demographics, and they did not require their participants to
contact them via their real name or even a real email. And they specifically had instructions on how to set up anonymous emails for these interviews. They also made sure that all the interviews were performed in the participants' first language, and the different language interviewers were occasionally sync up after a couple interviews in order to ensure that they were not straying too far from the protocol or that they were updating the protocol as needed. So the protocol itself started out by asking questions about experiences in sex work, specifically asking about what they did for work, and then asking them to expand on that if they didn't mention sex work. They also asked about how long they had been in the profession and the general type of sex work performed, whether it was mostly in person or online, gathering details about that. They first asked about non-work related technology use, so if they had personal social medias, the ways that they communicated with their friends, before going into the specific ways the participants use technologies for sex work, including contacting clients, payment methods, and then they concluded part of their interview with asking about the general ways that sex workers use technology for their work. So for the analysis, they did a grounded theory open coding process, so similar to the previous paper we just discussed. So authors independently read four transcripts to develop a thematic overview of how they build and start to building a code book. They reached saturation after about 10 interviews, and then they went and recoded all those interviews to fill out the code book. A couple interesting results. They found that the majority of platforms created by sex workers that sex workers use were not designed or run by sex workers. And they found that this meant that a lot of platforms were either exploiting the workers, and that this meant that workers needed to develop a complex networks of accounts and platforms in order to effectively perform in the profession. And they also found that American puritanical values and American opinions on morality and domination of the internet made it difficult to operate as a sex worker because platforms are allowed to discriminate against sex workers even when they are not using them for sex work. And they put a lot of the privacy of sex workers at risk.
What did you like about it?
I thought it was very well written, but then I also thought that a lot of the results were interesting because the workers did talk. The results from the workers talked a lot about how they had to continuously skirt around guidelines and operate basically. A lot of them, even though they were working legally, felt like that they were operating like kind of like criminals because of how shady they had to be and how most of their work was still it was very difficult to work through.
More on the paper itself. And sort of the study design and rigor, all that.
Can you explain more about the open coding part of the analysis? For example?
There weren't actually a lot of details in it. They mentioned that a lot of the details were kept. They didn't want to include a lot of the details to protect the workers' privacy. And to be honest, this isn't the type of work I typically do, so I don't actually understand a lot of what they did. But
That's fine, yeah. Keep the style up.
I think initially they mentioned that they came up with an analysis, or at least the initial protocol using 4 interviews. I believe something.
yeah, so yeah, they took a couple of they performed the first couple interviews, and then they had 3 or 4 authors each read multiple of them to develop the initial code book. And then as the interviews, and after they reached saturation, they went through, finished developing the code book, and then used that for the rest of the interviews. to my understanding.
Yeah, this is great. I could say a bit more about this. Please finish.
No, I was just curious about the 4 because it seemed like a very small number to me.
Right, so, I guess this is the pragmatic reason here, there's nothing bad about the 4. You wanna, so the reason I do this is, because, so it sounds like all the researchers were involved in the analysis of the interview data, or, I don't know, a large number of them.
Yeah, there are only 4 authors, and I think all 4 of them,
So all
3 or
authors
4.
were involved in the analysis of data, but not all the 4 authors were present in the interviews. Is that right?
Correct.
Right? So now, this first step is just to familiarize yourself with the data. Right? It's sort of precursor to formal analysis, if you will, or systematic analysis. Is to familiarize yourself with the data, because you were not necessarily in those interviews, right? Maybe you were in some, maybe you weren't at all, right? So, you know, you read through a few to familiarize yourself with the data. Alternatively, you could have been, you know, in all of them and already be familiar with the data. But the point is, you have to be somewhat familiar with the data you're looking from it. And then the whole this grounded theory process, we've heard this a number of times already. There's very strict rules for what counts as grounded theory. I don't know that I want to go into any of that. This is sort of a long-standing debate about, you know, no, this doesn't count, and we have to do it this way, and sort of a very technical, I don't know, very interesting argument. I think at the very least for, you know, this audience, is this idea that you build theory from the ground up. It's grounded in the raw data. So that's hence the name. So how do you do this, right? The systematic process is one of aggregation and synthesis and construction of relationships between things that are emerging. So at the most basic level, and we'll do this, I think, hands-on next time in class, you know, you start with coding. Coding is raw labeling of the input data. If you're reading through the transcripts and you're assigning, you know, keywords to things people are saying, this is a very close to the data, fine-grained, low-level first pass. We're trying to identify what people are saying and, you know, label, summarize a bit. We're trying to summarize a bit, right? You want to remove all the unnecessary verbosity and summarize a bit of what people are saying, but you're not doing synthesis yet. You're summarizing. That's it. Everything stays the same. Right. So, is there some independently read about planning over to? Okay.
What would the sample coding look like? Like, is it based on your research questions and you have a hypothesis of what?
Yes, usually, yes. So it's okay to skip some questions, right, that are maybe out of scope. You don't have to do everything literally. And to give focus selectively on the things that matter for your research question, that's fine. But this is a process of summarization. And you assign some labels that are descriptive labels of that paragraph or whatever, sentence you're summarizing. So now, you know, usually you do this separately between different authors. And also you do this on, you know, a few interviews at first. So what you will discover is that maybe we assign, maybe 2 people, the researchers assign different codes or labels to essentially the same idea, right? Or maybe you realize that some of these things, you know, can be slightly merged or whatever, right? They're sort of variations of the same idea or whatever, right? So there's usually this iterative process of refinement of this code book that happens through discussion between the research team, people doing the analysis. And as you're analyzing more interviews, you're sort of iteratively refining your code book. Code book is a set of labels, a set of codes with example sentences or quotes verbatim from the interview transcripts that illustrate those labels, right? So that you can, trace them back to what the raw data actually was. These should be just summaries. There's no synthesis at this point just yet. But they're descriptive summaries of verbatim things from the transcripts. So now, at some point, right through this process of iteration, your code book stabilizes, meaning you will have done 10 interviews, and you're satisfied that your code book makes sense, and that it accurately summarizes the 10 interviews you will have iterated on so far. Right? This is a very effort-intensive process. Involves multiple researchers, lots of iteration, twice as expensive. But at this point, when you're happy that the code book is stable, you can farm this up. This is why this is useful. So you can say, look, we have a stable code book. So now we don't all have to read all of the remaining interviews and analyze them and code them. How about we divide them up, right? So the 4 authors, you could say, we each take a fourth of the remaining ones. And we take the code book that we've developed on the first 10, and we apply it to the remaining however many. And so this, is a practical way of doing this.
And if you feel like you would want to change the code book at this point,
Yeah, you still can, right? And probably should, right? You have more of these rounds of negotiated agreement is a technical term to see people. You negotiate with your other analysts, researchers, whether you want to change the code book, introduce new code, refine the whole one, whatever. You do this.
I have a big question around like code books and like the scientific soundness of the process.
Yeah.
So I think some of the slides earlier or the presentations earlier mentioned like inter-annotator agreement.
Yeah.
I don't know if these authors mentioned that. And also like you mentioned, once the code book is stabilized, we can divide the rest of the work into like separate reviewers.
You don't have to, but you can. Yeah.
But like what, in your experience, what's been like the most sound approach? Like, is it that, let's say you have 100 different documents to label, you create a test set and show inter-annotator agreement on that, and then divide up the rest, or you divide up everything such that at least every document is at least reviewed by 2 annotators? Like, in your experience, or what would you prefer?
This is a pragmatic. This question involves a pragmatic answer. It's whatever you can afford to be. The more the better, but whatever you can do. Do you have enough students that can actually do this, etc.? How much time do you have? What's the deadline? Whatever. But
Yeah,
you're subject to all of these worldly constraints.
how important is this in the Cohen thing?
These kinds of quantitative measures of agreement are not very common nor very important in something that's fundamentally subjective and interpretive. Trying to put numbers on something that's hard to measure. But I think when you can do something like this, it increases trust. Again, like the previous question, like why should I trust what you're reporting in the paper? Right? Because look, like, at least among the authors, like you all agree that you're interpreting the same thing, you're seeing the same thing. So one more thing before we run out of time. All of this that we've talked about so far, this code book construction and coding and whatnot, all of this is still just the first step. Like at this point, we're operating on essentially summaries of the raw data, but we've not done any synthesis and aggregation. So the next step is where the actual theory building starts. Right, so the next step is you aggregate codes into themes. You start to see and build relationships between codes and between themes even and so forth. But the next step is the interesting and important step. And often you will see thematic analysis papers, which is like the most basic thing there is, meaning you take the codes, usually many, and you aggregate them into cohesive themes that group multiple codes together. We'll see this firsthand, hands-on interaction. And then you stop, you just report what the teams work. For example, in the previous paper was that these types of challenges that people were experiencing with prompt programming. Those were the themes. So 4 themes, each theme was a collection of codes, and that's the end, right? You stop there. You can go further and actually start to reason about relationships between themes, about, like mechanisms and so forth. Like you just actually start working through the theory here, but at the very least, the theory could be purely descriptive, and that means reporting on the themes themselves. Let's stop here because looks like we're going to get kicked out. I'll see you guys. Thanks a lot, Eddie.